The thunder rolled across the Montana sky like the distant rumble of 1,000 hooves as Wade Buckley stood on the weathered porch of his ranch house, watching the storm clouds gather on the horizon. His calloused hands gripped the railing, knuckles white with tension, face hard as the mountains that surrounded his land. Wade wasn't known for gentleness, not in the way he rode, not in the way he worked, and certainly not in the way he spoke. In 1878, the Montana Territory demanded strength above all else, and Wade had spent his 30 years cultivating a voice that carried over stampeding cattle and commanded respect from the roughest of ranch hands. "Thunderation!" he bellowed as the first fat raindrops began to fall. "Cooper! Jenkins! Get those horses under cover before this storm breaks proper." His men scrambled to obey, knowing better than to hesitate when Wade Buckley gave an order. The Rocking Bee Ranch wasn't the biggest spread in the territory, but Wade ran it with iron efficiency. He'd carved it out of the wilderness with his own sweat and determination after returning from fighting in the war between the states, building it log by log, acre by acre, until it represented everything he'd fought to protect independence, hard work, and the promise of the West. Wade watched his men corral the last of the horses into the barn, then turned to go inside as the rain began to fall in earnest. His boots echoed on the wooden floor of the cabin he'd built himself, the sound matching the rhythm of the rain on the roof. The place was sparse but functional, a bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, a small stove, and a few shelves holding his meager possessions. Wade had never seen the need for more, never felt the absence of a softer touch around his home. Until now. The telegram that had arrived that morning lay on the table where he'd tossed it. He picked it up again, reading the words that had disrupted his carefully ordered life. "Cousin Beatrice arriving Saturday. Stop parents killed in accident. Stop needs home. Stop only family left. Stop." Wade cursed under his breath. His mother's sister's daughter, a city woman from back east he'd never even met, was arriving in 2 days' time. What in tarnation was he supposed to do with a grieving female relative? His ranch was no place for a woman, especially one used to the comforts of Philadelphia society. The next day, Wade rode into town with a storm cloud hanging over his head that matched the gray skies above. He tied his horse outside the general store and stomped inside, nodding curtly to Mrs. Peterson behind the counter. "Mornin', Wade," she said cheerfully. "What brings you to town today?" "Need supplies," he said gruffly. "Got company coming." Mrs. Peterson's eyebrows shot up. "Company? At the Rocking Bee? Well, I never." Wade scowled. "My cousin, from Philadelphia. Parents died." "Oh, you poor dear." Mrs. Peterson clucked sympathetically, misinterpreting his frown for grief. "And who might this cousin be?" "Woman named Beatrice Kincaid," Wade said, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. "Never met her." Mrs. Peterson's eyes widened with interest. "A lady from Philadelphia coming to stay at your bachelor ranch? My word, you'll be needing some proper provisions then. Let me help you." Before Wade could protest, Mrs. Peterson was bustling around the store, gathering items and chattering away about what a proper lady would require. Wade found himself leaving the store with far more than he'd intended to purchase, including items he couldn't even name the purpose of. Saturday dawned clear and bright. As if the Montana sky was welcoming the newcomer Wade was dreading. He hitched his wagon and drove into town to meet the stagecoach, his mood as dark as thunderclouds. The stage was due at noon, and Wade arrived with just minutes to spare, positioning himself stiffly outside the station, hat in hand. The coach arrived in a cloud of dust, the driver calling out to his team as he pulled them to a stop. Wade stood straight, scanning the faces as passengers began to disembark. A businessman in a suit, a young couple, an older gentleman, and then she appeared. Beatrice Kincaid stepped down from the stagecoach with hesitation in her movements, but determination in her eyes. She was dressed in a traveling suit of deep blue, her honey blonde hair tucked neatly beneath a small hat. She was younger than Wade had expected, perhaps 25, and the black armband on her sleeve spoke silently of her recent loss. Wade cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Miss Kincaid," he called out, his voice carrying across the station platform with its usual force. She turned toward him, and Wade was struck by the clarity of her green eyes, rimmed with the unmistakable redness of recent tears. "Mr. Buckley?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "That's right." Wade awkwardly extended his hand, then withdrew it, unsure of the proper greeting for a female relation. "Wade Buckley, your mother was my mother's sister." "Yes, I know." She offered a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you for agreeing to take me in. I didn't have anywhere else to go." Wade nodded stiffly. "Got your bags?" Beatrice pointed to two modest trunks being unloaded from the stage. Wade moved to collect them, surprised at their weight. He'd expected a city woman to travel with more frippery. "This all?" he asked as he loaded the trunks into his wagon. "Yes," she replied simply, accepting his hand to help her climb onto the wagon seat. "I sold most of our belongings to pay off Father's debts. These contain only necessities." Wade grunted in response and climbed up beside her. The wagon lurched forward as he snapped the reins, and they were off, leaving the small town of Silver Creek behind them. The journey to the Rocking Bee was 16 miles of rugged terrain, and Wade wasn't accustomed to making conversation. They rode in silence for nearly half an hour before Beatrice spoke. "It's beautiful country," she observed, looking out at the rolling hills and distant mountains. "So different from Philadelphia." Wade responded, keeping his eyes on the trail ahead. "Have you lived here long?" she pressed. 13 years. Built the ranch after the war." "You fought in the war between the states?" Wade nodded. "Union cavalry." "My father as well," Beatrice said softly, "though he was infantry." Wade glanced at her, noting the sadness in her profile. "Sorry about your parents," he said gruffly. "Telegram didn't say what happened." Beatrice's hands tightened in her lap. "Fire," she said after a moment, "in our home. I was visiting a friend that evening. By the time I returned—" Her voice trailed off. Wade shifted uncomfortably on the seat. He'd never been good with emotional matters. "Tough break," he said, his voice still carrying its usual force despite his attempt at sympathy. Beatrice flinched slightly at his tone, but nodded. "Yes, it was." They lapsed back into silence, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady plodding of the horse's hooves. Wade stole occasional glances at his passenger, noting the straight line of her back, the determined set of her chin, despite the loss evident in her eyes. There was something there that reminded him of himself, a stubbornness that spoke of survival. As they crested the final ridge before the ranch came into view, Wade cleared his throat. "There it is," he said, pointing with his chin. "The Rocking Bee." Beatrice leaned forward slightly, taking in the sight of the ranch spread out below them. The main house, Wade's cabin, stood in the center, with the barn, bunkhouse, and various outbuildings arranged around it. A corral full of horses sat to one side, and beyond that, the grazing land stretched out toward the foothills, dotted with cattle. "It's substantial," Beatrice said, and Wade thought he detected genuine appreciation in her voice. "Built most of it myself," he replied, unable to keep a note of pride from his voice. "Started with just the cabin." "You've accomplished a great deal," she said. Wade nodded and snapped the reins again, urging the horses down the slope toward home. As they pulled into the yard, several ranch hands emerged from the bunkhouse, curious about the newcomer. Wade ignored their stares as he brought the wagon to a halt in front of the cabin. "Men, this is Miss Kincaid," he announced loudly. "My cousin. She'll be staying with us. Treat her with respect." The men nodded and tipped their hats, murmuring greetings. Beatrice acknowledged them with a graceful nod of her head. "Cooper," Wade called to his foreman, "help with these trunks." Cooper, a weathered cowboy in his 40s, stepped forward to assist, and together they carried Beatrice's belongings into the cabin. Wade had spent the previous evening making adjustments to his living space, partitioning off a corner with a hastily constructed screen to provide Beatrice with some privacy. It wasn't much, but it was the best he could manage on short notice. "This is where you'll sleep," he said, gesturing to the screened area where he'd set up a narrow bed. "It's not much, but it's clean." Beatrice surveyed the modest accommodations with an unreadable expression. "Thank you," she said finally. "It will be fine." Wade nodded, relieved she wasn't going to complain. "Outhouse is out back. Pump for water's outside too. We eat at sunup and sundown. Rest of the time, you're on your own." I understand, Beatrice replied, removing her hat and gloves. Mr. Buckley. Wade, he corrected her. Wade, she amended. I want you to know that I don't intend to be a burden. I can cook, clean, sew whatever needs doing around here. I'm not afraid of hard work. Wade studied her for a moment. Her hands, though not as calloused as his own, showed signs of labor. Good, he said simply. Because there's plenty to be done on a ranch. That evening, Wade watched with surprise as Beatrice took over his kitchen, preparing a stew with the provisions he'd purchased in town. She moved efficiently, showing more practical knowledge than he'd expected from a city woman. When the meal was ready, they sat across from each other at his small table, the silence between them broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls. This is good, Wade said after several bites, his voice booming in the small cabin. Beatrice started at the volume. Thank you, she said. My mother taught me to cook when I was young. She said it was an important skill for every woman, regardless of station. Wade nodded, then frowned as he saw Beatrice wince slightly. Something wrong with the food? He asked. No, not at all, she said quickly. It's just, you speak very loudly. It startled me. Wade blinked, unused to anyone commenting on his manner of speech. On the ranch, a man needed to be heard over the wind, the cattle, the general commotion of ranch life. He'd never considered that his normal speaking voice might be too forceful for quiet conversation. Sorry, he said, making no real attempt to modulate his volume. Used to giving orders to men and cattle. Beatrice offered a small smile. I understand. It just might take some getting used to. The first week of their arrangement passed in a state of awkward adjustment. Wade continued his regular duties on the ranch, riding out at dawn and returning at dusk, while Beatrice set herself to making improvements to the cabin. Wade would return each evening to find some new touch curtains on the windows, a tablecloth, flowers in a jar on the table, small changes that somehow made the place feel different. The food improved too. Wade had subsisted for years on basic, functional meals, but Beatrice brought variety and flavor to the table. She managed to stretch their provisions in ways Wade hadn't thought possible, even baking bread when previously he'd made do with hardtack on the trail and occasional purchases from town. On her 8th day at the ranch, Wade returned from checking fence lines to find Beatrice on her knees in front of the cabin, digging in the dirt. What are you doing? He called out as he dismounted. Beatrice looked up, shielding her eyes from the setting sun. I'm starting a kitchen garden, she explained. Mrs. Peterson at the general store gave me some seeds. We'll have fresh vegetables by summer's end. Wade frowned. Lot of work for some vegetables. Worth it, though, Beatrice replied, returning to her digging. Fresh food tastes better, and it'll save money in the long run. Wade watched her for a moment, noting the determined set of her shoulders, the way she attacked the hard prairie soil. There was a strength to her he hadn't initially recognized, not the obvious physical power of his ranch hands, but something more enduring, a quiet persistence. Need help? He asked, surprising himself with the offer. Beatrice looked up again, equally surprised. Yes, actually, this ground is quite hard. Wade removed his gloves, set them on the porch with his hat, and rolled up his sleeves. Kneeling beside her, he took the small garden tool she'd been using and began to break up the soil with efficient movements. Thank you, Beatrice said softly. This would have taken me hours alone. Wade nodded but didn't respond, focusing on the task at hand. They worked side by side until dusk, preparing a small plot for Beatrice's seeds. When they finally stood, dusting the dirt from their clothes, Wade felt an unfamiliar sense of accomplishment, different from completing ranch chores, somehow more personal. Should grow well here, he said, looking down at their work. Good soil once you break through the top. I hope so, Beatrice replied, looking up at him with a smile that reached her eyes for the first time since her arrival. Thank you, Wade. That night, as they sat at dinner, Wade made his first conscious effort to speak more softly. How'd you learn about gardening in the city? He asked, his voice still carrying, but not quite as forcefully as usual. Beatrice looked up in surprise at the change in his tone. We had a small yard behind our house in Philadelphia. Mother insisted we grow some of our own food, even though Father could afford to buy whatever we needed. She said it kept us connected to the earth. Wade nodded thoughtfully. Smart woman. She was, Beatrice agreed, a shadow passing over her face. Both my parents were intelligent people. Father was a professor at the university. Mother taught piano lessons. Music, huh? Wade looked around the sparse cabin. No piano here. No, Beatrice said with a small smile. But I notice you have a fiddle on that shelf. Wade's eyes followed her gesture to the battered old fiddle gathering dust on his bookshelf. Was my father's, he said gruffly. Don't play it much anymore. Do you play well? Beatrice asked. Wade shrugged. Used to. Before the war. Would you play something now? The request was gentle, her eyes hopeful. Wade hesitated, then stood and retrieved the instrument. He hadn't touched it in years, but his fingers remembered the feel of it, the weight. He tightened the bow, checked the tuning, and after a moment's consideration, began to play a simple folk tune his father had taught him long ago. The music filled the small cabin, rough at first, as Wade's fingers reacquainted themselves with the strings, but gradually smoothing out as muscle memory took over. When he finished, he looked up to find Beatrice watching him with shining eyes. That was beautiful, she said softly. Wade felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the evening's exertion. Thanks, he said, his voice unusually quiet. As the days turned into weeks, a routine developed between them. Wade continued his ranch work, but found himself returning to the cabin earlier each day, drawn by the prospect of Beatrice's company at dinner. For her part, Beatrice threw herself into making the cabin more livable, while also helping with lighter ranch chores, feeding chickens, gathering eggs, and tending to her growing garden. One evening in late May, a violent spring storm rolled in, just as Wade was returning from the north pasture. He raced his horse into the barn as the first lightning bolt split the sky, quickly seeing to the animal's needs before dashing through the downpour to the cabin. He burst through the door, soaked to the skin, to find Beatrice placing towels by the fire to warm. I saw you coming, she explained, handing him one of the heated towels. You should change before you catch your death. Wade accepted the towel gratefully, surprised by her thoughtfulness. He retreated behind his side of the cabin to change into dry clothes, emerging to find Beatrice had prepared hot coffee. Storm's getting worse, he commented as thunder shook the cabin's walls. Beatrice nodded, a flicker of unease crossing her face as another lightning bolt illuminated the room through the windows. It reminds me of the storms back home, she said. I've never been fond of thunder. Wade studied her face in the firelight, noting the tension around her eyes. It'll pass, he said, consciously lowering his voice to a gentler rumble that nearly matched the distant thunder. Cabin's solid, built it to withstand worse than this. Beatrice nodded gratefully at his reassurance. They sat by the fire, listening to the storm rage outside, sipping coffee and talking more freely than they had before. Wade found himself sharing stories of his early days on the ranch, the challenges he'd faced, the mistakes he'd made, the triumphs he'd achieved. Beatrice listened attentively, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. In turn, she spoke of her life in Philadelphia, her father's academic career, her mother's music, the small social circle they had inhabited. Wade was surprised to learn that, despite their comfortable circumstances, Beatrice had been raised with practical skills and a strong work ethic. Father believed in education for women, she explained. He insisted I attend university, despite what others might think. But Mother ensured I learned practical matters as well. Cooking, sewing, household management. She said a truly educated person should be capable in both mind and body. Wise woman, Wade commented. Out here, being book smart isn't enough. Need to know how to survive. I'm learning that, Beatrice said with a small smile. Though I admit I still have much to learn about ranch life. The conversation flowed easily between them, the storm outside gradually receding as the hours passed. Wade found himself speaking more quietly than usual, his voice a low rumble rather than his customary boom. He noticed that Beatrice seemed more relaxed with this gentler tone, leaning in to hear him rather than startling at his volume. As the fire burned low and the storm finally moved on, Beatrice stifled a yawn. I should retire, she said, rising from her chair. Thank you for the conversation, Wade. It was comforting during the storm. Wade nodded, feeling strangely reluctant for the evening to end. Sleep well, he said, his voice soft in the quiet cabin. The next morning, Wade woke at his usual hour before dawn, moving quietly through his morning routine to avoid disturbing Beatrice. As he prepared to leave for his day's work, he glanced toward her partitioned sleeping area and was struck by a sight that stopped him in his tracks. The partition had shifted slightly in the night, offering a glimpse of Beatrice asleep on her narrow bed. Her honey-blonde hair was loose around her shoulders, her face peaceful in sleep, one hand tucked beneath her cheek. Wade stood transfixed, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she looked, how trusting she must be to sleep so soundly in a strange place, in a house with a man she barely knew. Something shifted in Wade's chest, a feeling he couldn't immediately identify. She had trusted him, had entered his rough world and begun to carve out a place for herself. And in that moment, watching her sleep, Wade realized with startling clarity that he didn't want her to leave. The realization unsettled him enough that he left the cabin more hastily than usual, throwing himself into his work with unusual intensity. He spent the day mending fences in the far pasture, trying to make sense of his changing feelings. Wade had lived alone for so long that the presence of another person in his space should have been an irritation. Instead, Beatrice's company had become something he looked forward to, something that made returning to the cabin feel like coming home in a way it never had before. That evening, when Wade returned to the cabin, he found Beatrice waiting with dinner ready as usual, but something had shifted between them. The comfortable silence they shared no longer felt awkward, but companionable. When Wade spoke, he continued the practice of moderating his voice, finding it increasingly natural to speak more softly in her presence. As spring turned to summer, the changes at the Rocking Bee became more noticeable. Beatrice's garden flourished, providing fresh vegetables that improved their meals. The cabin itself was transformed, still simple and functional, but with touches of comfort and beauty that Wade would never have considered important before. More significant were the changes in Wade himself. His men noticed that he was less likely to bellow orders across the yard, more inclined to walk over and speak directly to them. His perpetual scowl eased, and occasionally they even caught him smiling. Cooper, his foreman, commented on it one afternoon as they rode the fence line together. "Miss Kincaid seems to be settling in well," the older man observed casually. Wade nodded. "She's adaptable." "Mm-hmm," Cooper hummed non-committally. "Ranch feels different with her around. Better, I'd say." Wade shot him a look, but couldn't disagree. "She's good company," he admitted. Cooper smiled slightly. "Never thought I'd see the day Wade Buckley would be tamed by a city woman." "I ain't tamed," Wade protested, but without heat. "Just adjusting." "Sure, boss," Cooper replied, amusement clear in his voice. "Whatever you say." The truth, which Wade was reluctant to acknowledge even to himself, was that he was increasingly drawn to Beatrice in ways that went beyond familial duty or friendliness. He found himself noticing details about her, the way sunlight caught in her hair, the graceful movements of her hands as she worked, the musical quality of her laugh on the rare occasions he managed to amuse her. But Beatrice was his cousin distant, yes, but still family, and more importantly, she was under his protection. Wade had always prided himself on being honorable, and taking advantage of a woman who had nowhere else to go would be the height of dishonor. So he kept his growing feelings carefully contained, maintaining a respectful distance even as they grew more comfortable in each other's company. He taught her to ride properly, not side saddle, as she'd learned in the East, but astride like a true Westerner. She took to it with surprising enthusiasm, soon accompanying him on shorter rides around the property. On one such ride in early July, they stopped to rest their horses at the top of a ridge overlooking the ranch. The summer sun bathed the landscape in golden light, the grass rippling in the breeze like waves on a green ocean. "It's beautiful here," Beatrice said, her voice filled with genuine appreciation. "I never imagined I could love a place so different from my home." Wade glanced at her, struck by her choice of words. "You love it here?" Beatrice turned to meet his gaze, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. "I do," she admitted. "I've come to think of the Rocking Bee as home, strange as that might seem after such a short time." Wade felt his heart quicken at her words. "Not strange," he said softly. "Ranch has a way of getting under your skin." "It's not just the ranch," Beatrice said, looking out over the landscape again. "It's everything. The work, the purpose, the people." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The family I've found here. Wade's throat tightened with emotion he wasn't accustomed to feeling. You're welcome to stay as long as you like, he said, his voice gentler than he'd ever thought it could be. Rocking B could use a woman's touch permanent-like. Beatrice looked at him sharply, searching his face. Wade, are you just saying you've made a place for yourself here? He clarified hastily, suddenly uncertain of his ground. Men appreciate the cooking. Garden's coming along good. Place looks better. Beatrice's expression faltered slightly, but she nodded. Thank you. I'm glad to be useful. They rode back to the ranch in silence, Wade cursing himself for his cowardice. He'd had the perfect opportunity to express his growing feelings, but had retreated behind practicalities instead. The truth was, he was afraid of rejection, afraid of changing the comfortable relationship they had established, afraid of discovering that Beatrice saw him only as a gruff, rough-edged relation who'd provided shelter in her time of need. July melted into August, bringing with it the hottest days of the summer. The work on the ranch intensified as they prepared for the fall, roundup, and cattle drive. Wade spent long days in the saddle, often returning to the cabin only after Beatrice had already retired for the night. One particularly scorching afternoon, Wade decided to check on a watering hole in the far pasture, concerned that it might be drying up in the heat. To his surprise, Beatrice asked to accompany him. You sure? He asked, eyeing the blazing sun. It's a hard ride in this heat. I'm sure, Beatrice replied firmly. I've been cooped up in the cabin all day. Besides, I should learn every part of the ranch if I'm to stay. The casual mention of staying sent a warmth through Wade's chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat. He nodded his agreement, and soon they were riding across the sun-baked landscape, the horses' hooves kicking up dust with every step. The watering hole was indeed lower than Wade liked, but still sufficient for the cattle grazing in that section of the ranch. After checking the water level, Wade suggested they rest in the shade of a large cottonwood tree before heading back. They dismounted, tethering their horses where the animals could drink, and settled beneath the tree's spreading branches. The heat was oppressive, but a slight breeze made the shade bearable. Wade offered Beatrice his canteen, watching as she took a careful drink. Thank you, she said, passing it back to him. A bead of sweat trickled down her temple, and without thinking, Wade reached out to brush it away with his thumb. The moment his skin touched hers, something electric passed between them. Beatrice's eyes widened, meeting his with a question he couldn't quite decipher. Wade withdrew his hand quickly, clearing his throat. Sorry, he muttered. Didn't mean to. It's all right, Beatrice said softly, her cheeks flushed with more than just the heat. They sat in charged silence for several moments before Beatrice spoke again. Wade, may I ask you something personal? He nodded, unsure of what was coming. Have you ever been married? The question caught him off guard. No, he answered truthfully. Never found the time, or the right woman, he added. Beatrice nodded thoughtfully. And now? Do you think you might want a family someday? Wade's heart hammered in his chest. Was this conversation headed where he thought it might be? Been thinking about it more lately, he admitted. Ranch could use an heir, and... He hesitated, then continued more softly. Cabin feels more like home with someone else in it. Beatrice's gaze met his, steady and questioning. Is that all I am to you? Someone to make the cabin feel like home? Wade swallowed hard, knowing he was standing at a crossroads. No, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. You're more than that, Beatrice. Much more. Her eyes softened, and she moved slightly closer to him beneath the tree. How much more, Wade? Wade had faced down angry bulls, hostile Indians, and armed outlaws, but nothing had ever terrified him as much as this moment of vulnerability. I'm not good with words, he said, frustration evident in his voice. Never have been, always too loud, too blunt. But since you came, I've been learning, trying to talk softer, to say things right. You have, Beatrice encouraged him. I've noticed. Wade took a deep breath, gathering his courage. Thing is, Beatrice, I didn't expect to feel this way. But now that you're here, I can't imagine the ranch or my life without you. Beatrice's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. What are you saying? Wade, I'm saying I care for you, he said, his voice gentle but clear. More than as family, more than as a friend. And I know it might not be proper, given how you came to be here, but I can't keep pretending otherwise. A tear slipped down Beatrice's cheek, and Wade felt his heart sink. He'd overstepped, misread the signs, ruined the comfortable relationship they'd built. But then Beatrice moved closer still, until she was sitting right beside him. "Wade Buckley," she said softly, "I was beginning to think you'd never say it." Before Wade could process her words, Beatrice leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a kiss so gentle it nearly broke him. When she pulled away, the smile on her face told him everything he needed to know. "You feel the same?" he asked, hardly daring to believe it. "I do," she confirmed. "I've grown to care for you deeply these past months. I just wasn't sure if you could see me as more than your distant cousin in need of charity." Wade shook his head firmly. "Never charity," he said. "And the cousin part is so distant it hardly signifies. My mother barely knew your mother growing up." "Still," Beatrice said thoughtfully, "people might talk." "Let them," Wade replied with unexpected fierceness, though his voice remained gentle. "I know what I feel, Beatrice. I've never been more certain of anything." They rode back to the ranch side by side, something new and fragile but undeniably strong growing between them. That evening, as they sat at dinner, Wade reached across the table to take Beatrice's hand in his. "There's something I need to ask you," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "It might seem sudden, but nothing about this has followed the usual course." Beatrice's eyes widened, but she nodded for him to continue. "I want you to stay," Wade said simply. "Not as my cousin, not as my housekeeper, but as my wife, if you'll have me." Beatrice's free hand flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. For a terrifying moment, Wade thought he'd misunderstood everything. But then she was smiling through her tears. "Yes," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Wade, I'll marry you." The transformation that swept over the rocking bee in the weeks that followed was remarkable. News of their engagement spread quickly through the small community, causing some raised eyebrows due to their distant familial connection, but mostly generating genuine happiness for the confirmed bachelor who had finally met his match. They were married in early September in Silver Creek's small church, with Cooper serving as Wade's best man, and Mrs. Peterson standing up for Beatrice. The entire ranch crew attended, along with most of the townsfolk who had come to know and appreciate Beatrice during her months in Montana. As they exchanged vows, Wade spoke his, with a gentleness that brought tears to the eyes of even the most hardened cowboys present. The loud, gruff rancher was still there. He would always be a man who could command attention when needed, but he had learned there was strength and softness too, that some moments called for words spoken just loudly enough for one person to hear. That night, as Wade and Beatrice lay together in the bed that was now truly theirs to share, Wade brushed a strand of hair from his new wife's face and marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Never thought I'd be grateful for a telegram bearing bad news," he murmured. "But if your parents hadn't passed, God rest their souls, you'd never have come west, never have found me." Beatrice touched his face gently. "Perhaps it was meant to be, in its own way. I like to think they would approve of where I've ended up and who I've chosen to build a life with." "I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of you," Wade promised. "You already are," Beatrice assured him. "Just by being exactly who you are, the man who learned to speak softly when it matters most." As autumn painted the Montana landscape in golds and reds, the rocking bee flourished under the care of its expanded family. Wade and Beatrice worked side by side, each bringing their own strengths to the partnership. The ranch hands noted with amusement that, while their boss had learned to modulate his voice when speaking to his wife, he could still bellow orders across the corral when necessary. A skill Beatrice herself was beginning to develop as she took on more responsibilities around the ranch. By the time winter settled over the land, bringing shorter days and long, cozy evenings by the fire, Beatrice had news that made Wade's heart swell with a joy he'd never thought possible. "A baby?" he asked, his voice cracking with emotion when she told him. "We're having a baby?" Beatrice nodded, her eyes shining. "Next summer, if all goes well. Our family is growing, Wade." Wade gathered her in his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, which, to him, she was. "I love you," he whispered against her hair, the words coming easily now, in the gentle tone he reserved just for her. Later that night, as Beatrice slept peacefully beside him, Wade watched the rise and fall of her breathing in the moonlight streaming through their window. He marveled at how this woman had changed him, had taught him that true strength sometimes lay in gentleness, that the loudest statement could sometimes be made in the softest voice. His hand rested protectively over the place where their child grew, and Wade Buckley, once the loudest, gruffest rancher in the Montana Territory, whispered promises of love and protection so quietly that even Beatrice didn't stir. The years that followed brought changes and challenges to the Rocking Bee. Their first child, a son they named William after Wade's father, arrived in the summer of 1879, bringing with him the kind of joy Wade had never thought possible. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 2 years later, her entrance into the world coinciding with the completion of the new, larger ranch house Wade had built for his growing family. The old cabin wasn't abandoned, though Wade converted it into an office for ranch business, preserving the place where their love had first blossomed. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, Wade and Beatrice would walk there together, remembering the early days of awkward silences and hesitant conversations. "Did you ever imagine we'd end up here?" Beatrice asked one such evening as they sat on the porch of the old cabin, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Wade took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Not in my wildest dreams," he admitted. "I was set in my ways before you came. Thought I knew everything about running a ranch, about living life. Never knew how much I was missing." Beatrice leaned her head against his shoulder. "And what was that?" "Someone to talk to at the end of the day," Wade said thoughtfully. "Someone who sees me as I am, but believes I can be better. Someone worth speaking softly for." Beatrice smiled up at him. "You've come a long way from the man who greeted me at the stagecoach." "Thanks to you," Wade said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "No," Beatrice corrected him gently. "The capacity for tenderness was always in you, Wade. You just needed the right reason to find it." As twilight deepened into night, they walked hand in hand back to their home, where their children slept peacefully and their future stretched out before them, as vast and promising as the Montana sky. Wade Buckley, once known for his thunderous voice and gruff manner, had learned that the most important words were those spoken softly, meant for just one person to hear the woman who had fallen asleep beside him and awakened something in his heart he hadn't known was there. And in the years that followed, as the Rocking Bee prospered and their family grew, Wade never forgot the lesson Beatrice had taught him, that true strength lay not in volume, but in sincerity, not in harshness, but in honesty. It was a lesson he passed on to his children, and later to his grandchildren, ensuring that the legacy of the Rocking Bee would always include not just the land and the cattle, but the love story that had transformed a loud, lonely cowboy into a man who knew the power of words spoken softly from the heart.